This is America's Roundtable from Washington, D.C., a weekly radio program with leading voices from America and international thinkers representing the academia, business, media, think tanks, and the political arena. I am Joel Anand, your co-host, joined by Natasha Srdoc, economist and co-founder of the International Leaders Summit. Nick Sorrentino is the editor and co-founder of CronyCapitalism.org. He's also a political and communications consultant with clients which span the ideological spectrum. He writes daily on economic and political issues, and his work has been featured at Reason.com, NPR.org, The Daily Caller, BigGovernment.com, and other publications. Mr. Sorrentino is a graduate of Mary Washington College and an entrepreneur, which many of us would call an intellectual entrepreneur as well. Nick, we welcome you to America's Roundtable.
Welcome, Nick.
Oh, thank you very much. Intellectual entrepreneur, okay.
It's in waging the war of ideas and presenting the competition of ideas, and it's a term that one of our colleagues in the think tank arena had come up with, so we thought perhaps we should introduce that to you as well.
I like it.
All right. Nick, what led you and your team to launch the initiative against crony capitalism?
Well, I don't have to tell you guys that government is getting larger and larger with each passing day. And what is often called, private-public partnerships are often vehicles for corruption. And that is at least what we see. Money is taken from the taxpayer, moved through the government, and then disseminated out to cronies, friends, political backers, and so on. And it's a problem that is growing, and we felt like somebody should address it. So we established CronyCapitalism.org about a year and a half ago, and it has grown steadily.
In fact, I was just wondering if you'd be open to sharing a few specific cases so that our listeners on America's Roundtable can get a better understanding of how crony capitalism is manifested in America today.
Well, I think a great example of this, and I need to be careful on how I couch this, but I would say, for instance, the situation in MF Global with John Corzine is a good example. There is significant evidence showing that some, let's just say, interesting things happened at MF Global that Mr. Corzine may or may not have been aware of, but since he was the CEO, there's at least a chance that he did. Essentially, Congress let him off the hook. The fact that he is a former senator, former governor, and perhaps most importantly, former CEO of Goldman Sachs may have something to do with the fact that he was not pursued with the tenacity that one might think somebody in this situation should have been. That's just an example. The green jobs initiatives initiated by the president, that money essentially it comes from taxpayers or is printed nowadays. And a lot of that money has gone to folks that back the president, all over the country. And these are not small amounts of money. Solyndra is the kind of the flagship for this, but there are dozens of other companies that are a lot like Solyndra in their economic feasibility without government subsidies. In other words, they wouldn't survive without the taxpayers paying for it. That sort of thing, when the government intervenes on behalf of special interests to take taxpayer dollars and send it to these special interests, that's pretty much the definition of crony capitalism.
Right, Nick. A few weeks ago, U.S. Senator Tom Coburn joined us on America's Roundtable and shared with our listeners his findings published in the Waste Book 2012. As Senator Coburn mentioned, I quote, Washington is set to spend at least $3.6 trillion this year while running a $1.3 trillion deficit. The waste is overflowing, unquote. And Dr. Coburn's Waste Book 2012 described nearly $20 billion of wasteful government spending, fraud, and duplication. Senator Coburn estimates also that there are some $200 billion in government waste and duplication, which could be eliminated if Congress would adopt a new tax reform. There are so many items that we can just look at it, and I would like to mention a few of them. Maybe you can comment on some of those just outrageous spending. There are tax loopholes for the National Football League, National Hockey League, and Professional Golfers Association that received some 91 million in taxes. There's Moroccan pottery classes, part of a $27 million grant from U.S. Agency for International Development. A robotic squirrel named RoboSquirrel, part of a $325,000 grant. I mean, what is preventing Congress from just canceling these expenses right away?
Well, for every dollar that goes to the taxpayer, and is then sent out in these programs, there's a constituency for it. There's somebody getting that money, and that's why the politically connected lean on their representatives to make sure that money keeps flowing. I mean, the RoboSquirrel story is a great story. I mean, it's pretty incredible, and the federal budget is rife with these sorts of abuses. And they are wasteful, and they are, in my opinion, not what government should be doing. But I will say also that as bad as these examples are, the waste and abuse, the level of waste and abuse, I think, has ratcheted up. When you start talking about the nationalization of auto industries, for instance, like GM, like essentially what we have done in this country to a large extent, or the creation of wholesale technologies by the sheer decree of the government, as we see in the Volt and elsewhere. The opportunity for fraud and even beyond just simple waste is immense. You know, the numbers we're talking about are much bigger than 20 billion or even 200 billion. They over 10 years, we're talking much larger numbers. And the example that I give people often is the Volt. Each one of those Volts driving down the road has at least $100,000 worth of subsidies in each one of those cars, at least. That's not a good use of money.
Nick, as we've been talking about crony capitalism in America, you've outlined a number of issues that we are facing here in the United States, whereby government spending has just basically, there is no accountability in that respect. And you have an online initiative with a great many of our fellow Americans reading your blogs and your information. And it also seems that the groups that we have in the U.S. at this stage here, we have a Tea Party movement as well as a Occupy movement, which to a certain degree have a similar mission about the concern of crony capitalism. The way in which Occupy probably has communicated is it's against capitalism, but in essence, what they really are talking about is against crony capitalism. And could you elaborate on some of the similarities and perhaps differences you see in these groups, and what can Americans do to keep their legislators accountable for the spending that goes on?
Yes, I completely agree with your assessment of the Tea Party situation and the Occupy situation. I actually had the pleasure of going down and spending a couple of days with Occupy last year in October before it got cold, just to kind of get a flavor for what was going on. And what was interesting is, as you talked with, or as I talked with these folks, you're right. It really was. Although they believe, a lot of them believe that crony capitalism is capitalism, and I had to explain the difference. But once you kind of burrowed down underneath that and started talking about what the real problem was, it was interesting. They hated the bailouts. The rich guys on Wall Street, they don't like Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan. Well, guess what? The Tea Party has a similar disposition, though a lot of people on the left don't share that, with the broader public. There's a feeling that the cards are stacked against most folks, and government and business are colluding. And in that respect, the Tea Party and Occupy are on the same page. Now, I will also say that both the Tea Party and Occupy have been co-opted by the establishment in many ways. I mean, although the Tea Party seems to be resurgent now in the wake of what I think a lot of us would consider a disastrous election, depending on your point of view, I suppose, it had been pushed off to the side for 2 years. The Democrats were able to engage Occupy and then push them off to the side too. The only thing that's going to change the nastiness that we see is people just getting out in the cyberspace street, and maybe on occasion in the street, and making their voices heard, and saying they're not going to put up with this, and saying that it's time for something new, a new political perspective. When one sees crony capitalism on display, and it's everywhere, and I fear that the fiscal cliff deal is just going to be just full of all sorts of nasty things. Get on the phone. Call your representative. They do care. I mean, if there's anything that motivates them is the fact that they want to keep their job. One would be surprised how effective that can be.
Yeah, and in fact, as Natasha Srdoc was mentioning a few moments ago, that we were delighted to have U.S. Senator Tom Coburn share with us some of his findings in Wastebook 2012. And it's important to remind our listeners on America's Roundtable that the government is set to spend a record $3.6 trillion this year and running a $1.3 trillion deficit, as communicated by Senator Coburn. And out of that, he mentioned about the fact that there's some, $200 billion of waste. And to a certain degree, you would think that this would be an issue that American taxpayers, those that are working and saving and trying to provide for their families or set aside funds for their children's education, American citizens ought to be very upset at the way Washington, D.C. is managing their funds. The issue of a balanced budget does not seem to be even in the dialogue and discussion today when we talk about a fiscal cliff. Rather than reducing taxes or reducing government spending and the fraud and the waste that we see, there is a push to saying, what can we do to raise taxes? What are your thoughts on that, Nick?
It's a power grab. Simple as that. It's the people who want an even larger government recognize that they have some momentum at this point. They are going to reach. Because it goes back all the way back to what was it, 1995 or 94, when the Republicans threatened, or essentially the government quote unquote shut down. Although I didn't notice the difference. The voters really made the Republicans pay. So the Democrats are essentially saying, okay, give us more taxes, or else we're going to blame this on you guys. And the Republicans are not interested in getting hammered again. So they'll probably fold, and we'll probably have a larger government. Now, saying that, between now and the whatever comes out of Washington happens, we can make our voices heard. And that's certainly what we're trying to do at againstkcronycapitalism.org. That's for sure.
And Nick, to go back to pure capitalism, as it was envisioned as a free market based on the rule of law, independent judiciary, protection of property rights, and higher levels of economic freedom, we see that the checks and balances in U.S. system are not anymore where they should be in order to be able to protect taxpayers' funding and streamline it in those areas that it's needed the most for those roles that government should be involved in. How do we change the system? How do we fight against crony capitalism? There are possibilities in having some term limits, possibly, to have a fully transparent campaign financing, to have an overhaul of campaign financing laws and political financing, to actually work on reducing omnibus legislation that gets to thousands of pages. An individual cannot read, and everything and anything is pushed in it by special interest that is not really related to the main subject. So how do you think that these three items, and if you can maybe elaborate on additional possible solutions, how do we stop these things from happening?
Well, I think that government has a trajectory generally, and that is to grow. Sadly, I don't think term limits will solve the problem. I think, I certainly wouldn't be against them. I think that's part of the equation, and how to keep people from sticking in their pet projects into legislation. Well, I don't really know, frankly. I do believe, however, that part of the solution is people just holding a big part of the solution is essentially people just saying, I'm going to designate a certain amount of my time, even though I'm busy, even though I have to take the kids to soccer practice and so on, to hold my representatives' feet to the fire, make a commitment. One of the ways that people ask me and say, well, how can I make a change on a day-to-day basis? How can I make a difference? But for a lot of us, our vote means very little in the political sphere. But the place where we can really make our vote count is actually in the marketplace. Buy products from companies that do business the right way and reward them by buying their product over and over and over again. The message will go out. I mean, I look at companies like GE, for instance. You can't get a decent light bulb now because of them. They had developed a technology that was expensive, and they wanted to make sure that they got paid. So they got Congress to pass a law for them. Don't buy their light bulbs. I mean, that's a simple thing that people could do. It's not going to solve the problem. It's really going to be, if we're lucky, in 25 years, we'll be able to say, I'll be able to say to my grandchildren, you know what, we were going down a really bad road, but we turned it around. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to constitute, as someone I'm a fan of, Ron Paul says, it's going to constitute a revolution in people's heads. It's going to be a different way of looking at the world. And that's the only way it's going to change.
It is interesting to note for our listeners that it's not just only that we spend wasteful spending here in the United States, but the United States and our taxpayer funds have been sent abroad. Nick, just for our discussion here, there was an interesting case that just surfaced, and you may be familiar with the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, which was established in the 1990s. And the United States initially contributed some $112 million to EBRD's technical cooperation and investment programs. Just a nice, certainly pontificated term here. But also, it's interesting to note that the value of joint U.S. EBRD investment to date basically is around 14.6 billion euros. And in fact, interestingly enough, that it doesn't add all the further investment, which is a joint American EBRD involvement, which is around $34.2 billion. Well, Natasha Srdoc has been working on a number of these cases in Eastern Europe and primarily noticed that these funds actually have permeated into Eastern Europe to support some of the oligarchs and tycoons. So rather than these funds going to small and medium-sized businesses, which was originally intended, now the funds are going to individuals, and one specific group just got, can you imagine when businesses in America, small businesses, have a tough time getting a loan to basically expand or hire new employees, whether it's one or two employees? The United States supports EBRD, and they just gave a check to a group called Atlantic Group in Croatia, which is headed up by a oligarch, a tycoon. The EBRD has arranged a 307 million euro financing to support Atlantic Group, a regional entity which is spearheaded by Emil Tedeschi in the region of the Balkans. And this is certainly partly coming from U.S. taxpayers to support tycoons rather than helping individuals here in America who are the real entrepreneurs and creating economic growth. And this is just the tip of the iceberg.
I would say that's an export of crony capitalism, which is unfortunate because we hear how people are saying similar things from neighboring countries and are very upset about it because they see what's happening in their countries, but they see it in a negative light towards the U.S., unfortunately, not knowing about the frustrations that are present here as well.
Well, it's funny that you bring up that topic because yesterday, in fact, on our Facebook page, A young man from Slovenia sent me a video of the protests going on in the street in his hometown. He explained, in his words, that Slovenia is a small, lovely country, by the way. He said the land was lovely, but his government was not, and that essentially the town councils and the central government were all in on the game, and the population is just looking around going, our entire system is utterly and completely corrupt, and now they're taking to the streets. So yeah, no, that is what we do. I mean, powerful people get connected in politics, and then they get the flow of money into their pocket. That seems to be the game. It's always been the game of politics. It's why, in my opinion, government should be as small as humanly possible. But with the economic downturn, a giant excuse has been given to these oligarchs, whether they be in the United States or in Europe, to essentially say, well, this is good for the economy. Send a check my way.
We would like to encourage our listeners to visit the site that Nick is talking about. It's called againstcronycapitalism.org. They have some 34,000 plus followers on Facebook, and certainly encourage your friends, your neighbors, your family members to seek that specific Facebook out and join this very important campaign on behalf of America's taxpayers and citizens. And are there specific projects that you're working on with your team members at againstcronycapitalism.org, Nick, that you'd like to share, or specific initiatives that we should be aware of?
The co-founder of againstcronycapitalism.org, Hunter Lewis, and I, as the fiscal cliff discussions are going on, there's talk of the elimination of the charitable deduction. And although we need to radically simplify the tax code, if the charitable deduction is gotten rid of, a lot of charities are going to, they won't have any money. And some people in government would prefer it to be that way, frankly, that social welfare program should be the purview of the government solely. We believe that is one of the reasons why the charitable deduction is in play right now. And so we have a petition, if you'd like to, if you don't want to see the charitable deduction go away, and frankly, a lot of people potentially go hungry or on the government dole, I'd encourage you to sign that. We would be appreciative.
And this would be on againstcronycapitalism.org.
That is correct.
And also they've got, you can certainly follow them on Twitter, on Facebook. They've got YouTube videos and other resources, certainly that are intended to educate the public and citizens and taxpayers in regard to what is happening at the state level, at the federal level, as well as what's going on abroad.
Yes, and some of the best stories that we get are from people who send them in to us. In addition to this young man from Slovenia, yesterday we got a great story from Pennsylvania. And every day, where the government and private interests come together, there's all sorts of nastiness, and the only way that can be fought is by shining a light on it. Interestingly, when the light is shined, it often goes away. So I encourage people to, if you see something, hey, here's something. If you see something, say something. Only this time, it's not on Amtrak. It's, we're talking about the government.
Right. And there's another instance that I would like to mention here, and that is USAID funding that helped establish, and that is actually mentioned on their website as one of the major accomplishments in Croatia, where they established mandatory negotiations between the trade unions, big government, and big business. That big business was mostly owned by government. Others were companies established by tycoons, whereby the three parties have to decide on any major reform passed in the country. I mean, can you imagine that USAID funding as a major accomplishment in Croatia? They practically brought trade unions, big businesses in a driver's seat position, which is very hard, impossible to dismantle. And it has blocked many of reforms in Croatia, and we just can't figure out how can we reverse that situation. I mean, it's so much damage that has been done.
Well, I would say that one of the things that needs to happen, and forgive me, I'm going to broaden it out a little bit. In the late 70s, when Professor Friedman started making his case to the American public, and Margaret Thatcher started making her case, and Ronald Reagan even made his case. And there are failures with all these folks or whatever, but in the late 70s, there was a rebirth of free market thinking, of classical liberalism. I talk with people, I say, I am a liberal. All right. I actually believe in freedom. Right. I don't believe in the state. Okay. I am a liberal, and I actually believe in progress, not progressivism. Okay. To the degree that the average individual can live free of coercion from the state and other people or other entities, that, in my opinion, is the definition of progress. We need folks who believe in freedom, liberty, on all levels, need to take it to the battlefield, because frankly, as you were talking about, in Croatia, I mean, it's just a giant club,
right?
And for the average person, the best opportunity for the average person to ever provide for their family and ever, move up in the world is through entrepreneurship. The establishment always wants to keep new money repressed. And right now, the government is helping to keep the average person who wants to grow the economy, who wants to build a business, they're on the wrong side. So we need to make that case.
And interestingly enough, we have had one of our regular guests, and actually our co-host, which is Maurice McTeague, who shared the experiences of what he did in New Zealand, where he privatized their postal services. He privatized their forestry sector, which was basically once held and very much controlled by the government. And we certainly need to move away from some of these ways that the government, both at the federal and state levels, are controlling certain sectors in a monopoly and sometimes with a significant benefit as a dominant player, and crowds out private sector competition. And therefore, we are losing out on several fronts as a consumer as well as a taxpayer. And we certainly appreciate the important work that Nick, you, your colleagues are doing at againstcronycapitalism.org. We look forward to our engaged and continued discussions in the days to come about how American taxpayers can be well informed about how their taxpayer dollars are being used, or in many cases being wasted, and how they can engage their local representatives, their members of Congress, their senators in addressing some of these issues. And we would certainly appreciate your final thoughts in regard to this major issue of the fiscal cliff and what citizens can do at the local level to press for real reform.
Well, first, let me say it's a pleasure always being on with you guys. I enjoy it. Folks, like I said earlier in the hour, designate a small amount of your day to paying attention. And when action is warranted, pick up the phone, send an email, identify the people, identify who are your senators, who is your representative. Trust me, that phone call matters. I don't know if this is the number they still use nowadays, but for every phone call that comes in on an issue, they assume that 14,000 people feel the same way. Well, that's power. So use it.
Thank you so much for joining us, Nick, on America's Roundtable. And for our listeners, we'd certainly encourage them to visit againstcronycapitalism.org and certainly spread the word about the good work that these folks are doing on behalf of taxpayers and citizens in America.
Thank you, Nick.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, guys.
This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share.